Patricia said the name like she was reading it off a grocery list, and the whole reception hall went quiet in a way I'd never heard a room go quiet before. My name is Naomi, and I was 38 years old, standing in a rented banquet hall smelling of sheet cake and centerpiece carnations, watching my mother-in-law hand my husband a card and say, in front of 40 relatives, "Make sure some of this goes to Ethan too, since he couldn't be here today." I remember exactly where I was standing, 3 feet from the gift table, my son Caleb's graduation cap still tucked under my arm because he'd handed it to me for a photo and never taken it back. I remember the exact temperature of the room, warm with too many bodies and not enough air conditioning. I remember thinking, in the half-second before anything made sense, "Who's Ethan?" The same flat, mildly curious thought you'd have about any unfamiliar name mentioned at a party. Then I looked at Marcus's face, and the thought stopped being flat. My husband is not a man who hides things well under pressure. That's always been one of the things I loved about him, the transparency of his discomfort, the way his ears go red before his mouth catches up to whatever's wrong. His ears were red. His hand, holding the card his mother had just passed him, had gone very still, the way a hand goes still when it's trying not to be noticed doing anything at all. "Mom," he said, and his voice had a warning in it I'd genuinely never heard him use with her before, not in 11 years of marriage, not through every argument about holidays or money or the time she told me, at our wedding, that she'd always pictured him with someone a little more established. Not now. "I just meant," Patricia started, and then stopped herself, glancing at me with an expression I would spend the next several weeks trying to properly name. Not guilt exactly. Something closer to the specific irritation of a woman who has just watched a carefully maintained fence get knocked over by her own hand. I have worked as a pediatric nurse for 14 years. I have delivered bad news to parents in small, fluorescent-lit rooms more times than I could count, and I have learned, in that job, to read a room's temperature in seconds, who's about to cry, who's about to argue, who already knows and is simply waiting to hear it said out loud. Standing in that banquet hall with my son's cap under my arm, I understood, with a kind of sick clarity, that everyone around me, my sister-in-law refilling her plate with a studied casualness, my father-in-law suddenly very interested in his phone, even my own son glancing between his father and grandmother with the confused half-smile of someone who thinks he's missed a joke, everyone in that room except me had some idea of who Ethan was. "Who?" I said, and my voice came out steadier than I expected. "Is Ethan?" The silence that followed lasted long enough that I understood, before a single word was spoken, that this was not going to be a small answer. 11 years earlier, when Marcus and I met, I fell in love with a man who seemed, on paper and in person, remarkably uncomplicated. He worked in insurance underwriting, methodical and steady, the kind of person who alphabetized his spice rack and never once, in the entirety of our courtship, gave me a reason to doubt where he was or what he was doing. His mother, Patricia, was harder to love but easier to explain, a retired schoolteacher with old-fashioned opinions about how a household should run, protective of her only son in a way I initially mistook for simple maternal devotion. I became, over the years, the person who managed Patricia. It happened gradually, the way most roles in a family happen gradually, one holiday where I smoothed over a comment about my cooking, one birthday where I found the diplomatic middle ground between what Patricia wanted and what Marcus was too tired to negotiate, until eventually it was simply understood, without anyone ever saying it directly, that keeping the peace between mother and son was my job. I believed, for a long time, that this made me indispensable to the family. I understand now that it also made me, in some ways, the last person anyone thought to be honest with, because honesty with me always seemed to require going through a mediator who was, unknowingly, mediating her own exclusion. The first sign, if I'm honest about it now, came 4 years into our marriage, when Caleb was still a toddler and we were going through old photo albums for a slideshow at Patricia's 60th birthday party. There was a stretch of photographs, maybe 18 months, spanning a period when Marcus would have been in his early 20s, that simply didn't exist. Patricia had explained it, when I asked, as a hard stretch. Financially, nobody was taking pictures then, and I'd accepted that the way you accept most small gaps in a family's history, without pressing, because pressing felt intrusive and unnecessary. I didn't think about that missing stretch of photographs again for years. It sat somewhere in the back of my mind the way unimportant details do, filed away without a label, until much later when it would suddenly matter enormously. The second sign came more directly, though I dismissed it just as completely. Marcus's college roommate, Tobias, came to visit us the year Caleb turned 6, and over drinks one evening, slightly looser-tongued than usual, he asked Marcus, "You ever hear anything more from Ethan's mom?" Man, that whole thing was rough. I remember Marcus's face going through a series of small, fast adjustments, surprise, then something sharper, then a smoothness that arrived just a beat too late to feel natural. Tobias means an old coworker, he told me later that night, before I'd even asked. Different guy. Long story, not interesting. I remember believing him, mostly because the alternative, that my husband was actively managing what I was and wasn't allowed to know, wasn't a thought I had any framework for yet. I want to stop here for a second. Because if you've ever had a small, strange detail explained away so quickly and so smoothly that you almost forgot you were the one who asked the question, you know exactly what that dinner felt like. Not suspicious, not yet. Just faintly, uncomfortably smooth, the way a lie feels before you have any reason to call it that. Over the following years there were other moments, small, easily explained, always explained, that I filed away in the same drawer as the missing photographs and Tobias's comment. A wire transfer on our joint statement, years back, made out to an unfamiliar name, that Marcus said was helping out an old friend, embarrassing situation, I'll tell you sometime. A phone call he took outside on a Sunday afternoon, pacing the length of our driveway in a way he never paced for work calls, that he described afterward as insurance stuff, boring, don't worry about it. None of these moments, taken individually, would have alarmed anyone. That's the particular cruelty of a well-managed secret, it doesn't arrive as one enormous lie. It arrives as 100 small, forgettable half-truths, each one reasonable enough on its own, each one designed to be the kind of thing you don't think to connect to the others until someone hands you the one piece that makes the whole pattern visible at once. The unease didn't become impossible to ignore until the year before Caleb's graduation, when Patricia's health took a turn that none of us had fully anticipated, a fall, a hip replacement, a long recovery that meant Marcus was driving out to her house 2 or 3 times a week, sometimes staying late into the evening helping her sort out paperwork. I didn't think much of this at first. It seemed like exactly what a devoted son would do for an aging mother, and some part of me, the part that had spent a decade managing Patricia's moods for the sake of family harmony, was almost relieved not to be the one handling it directly for once. What I noticed, slowly, over the months that followed, was a change in Marcus's phone habits. He'd never been secretive about his phone before. I could have picked it up at any point in our marriage and found nothing more scandalous than fantasy football league updates. That year, he started taking it into the bathroom when it rang in the evenings. He started deleting his call log, something I only noticed because I went looking for a plumber's number he'd texted me weeks earlier and found the history wiped clean past a certain date, an oddly specific erasure that struck me, even then, as more deliberate than accidental. I asked him about it once, directly, sitting across from him at our kitchen table on an ordinary Tuesday. "You've been weird about your phone lately," I said. "Everything okay?" He didn't look up from what he was doing immediately, some small, unnecessary delay, the fork pausing over his plate for just a half-second too long before he set it down and looked at me with an expression I want to describe as practiced, though at the time I only registered it as tired. "It's just mom stuff," he said. "The hip recovery's stressing me out more than I'm letting on. I don't want to dump it on you on top of everything else you're carrying at work." I believed him. I want to be honest about that, because it matters. I wasn't a fool being deliberately blind. I believed him because it was a reasonable explanation, offered by a man I had 11 years of evidence to trust, and because some part of me needed it to be true more than I needed to keep asking questions I sensed, without being able to say why, that I might not actually want answered. Some of you already know this feeling. The one where you stop pushing out a question not because the answer stopped mattering, but because some part of you has already started preparing for what it might cost you to hear it. The real crack came 6 months before graduation, during one of Patricia's recovery visits, when I stopped by unannounced to drop off a casserole and let myself in with the spare key I'd had for years. I found her sitting at her kitchen table with a stack of mail, and on top of it, addressed to her, was an envelope from a school district 2 counties over, the return address printed with a name that meant nothing to me at the time, Ethan M. Whitfield. I didn't open the envelope. I want to be clear about that, because what I did instead feels, looking back, almost more damning of the family's careful architecture than anything else. I asked Patricia, casually, who Ethan Whitfield was, and she answered without missing a beat, in the smooth, unhurried voice of someone who had clearly rehearsed this exact deflection many times before. "Oh, that's just a former student of mine, sweetheart. I still keep up with a few of them. Sends me his report cards. If you can believe it, I was the only teacher who ever believed in that boy." It was, I understand now, a nearly perfect lie, plausible, warm, entirely consistent with the version of Patricia I'd known for 11 years, a retired teacher proud of a student she'd once mentored. I left that afternoon having noticed nothing wrong at all, except for one small detail that stayed with me longer than it should have. As I set the casserole dish on her counter, I glanced back at her, and for just a moment before she composed herself, her hand was resting flat on top of that envelope, pressing down slightly, the way you press down on something you're afraid might otherwise be picked back up. I didn't understand, that day, what I was looking at. Looking back now, I understand it completely. I want to tell you that some dramatic instinct drove me to investigate after that afternoon at Patricia's kitchen table, but the truth is smaller and less flattering. What actually happened was that the name simply wouldn't leave me. Ethan M. Whitfield sat in the back of my mind for weeks, refusing to file itself away the way the missing photographs and Tobias's comment and the deleted call log had all managed to file themselves away for years. 3 weeks before Caleb's graduation, on a night Marcus had gone to bed early with a headache, I searched the name. It didn't take long to find him. Ethan Whitfield, 17 years old, a junior at a high school 2 counties over, playing varsity baseball, according to a local paper's write-up from the previous spring. There was a photograph attached to the article, a boy mid-swing, caught in that specific athletic blur where faces are hard to read clearly. I stared at that blurred photograph for a long time anyway, looking for something I couldn't name, some resemblance I both dreaded and half expected to find. It was a second search, later that same night, that gave me what I hadn't been prepared for. A community fundraiser page, 3 years old, raising money for a family's medical expenses, listing Ethan's mother as the primary organizer, a woman named Renee Whitfield. And in the comments, buried among dozens of well wishes, one from an account I recognized instantly, because it was Patricia's, a comment reading only, "Praying for you and that sweet boy, as always. P." I sat with my laptop open at our kitchen table for nearly an hour after that, feeling something I didn't have a clean name for. Not quite grief, because I didn't yet understand what I'd lost. Not quite anger, because anger requires a target and I still didn't fully understand who deserved it. Mostly I felt the specific, disorienting vertigo of realizing that an entire relationship, years of Sunday dinners, years of holiday visits, years of watching Patricia dote over my son as though he were the only grandchild in her universe, had existed alongside something I'd had absolutely no access to. I didn't confront anyone that night. I told myself I needed to understand the full shape of what I was looking at before I said a single word, which was true, but it was also the same old instinct I'd relied on my entire marriage: gather quietly, manage carefully, don't create a scene until you're certain the scene is warranted. I have spent so many years being the person who smooths things over for this family that even discovering what might be its largest secret, I still reached first for caution instead of confrontation. 10 days before graduation, doing what had become an almost compulsive late-night ritual, I found the piece of information that finally made everything click into a single, undeniable shape. A property records search, something I'd never have thought to look at, if not for a stray comment Patricia had made months earlier about helping the Whitfields with their mortgage situation, showed a modest house 2 counties over, co-signed 11 years earlier by Patricia Ellison and a woman named Renee Whitfield. 11 years. The exact length of my marriage to Marcus. I held that information privately for the 10 days leading up to graduation. I didn't tell Marcus what I'd found. I didn't tell Patricia. I confirmed, quietly, everything I needed to confirm, and I put my laptop away each night exactly as I found it, giving no outward sign that anything in my understanding of this family had shifted permanently. I want to be honest about what that cost me. Those 10 days were some of the hardest of my adult life. Sleep came in fragments, if it came at all, and I found myself standing in front of the open refrigerator some evenings with no memory of what I'd come looking for. Marcus, my husband, noticed I wasn't quite myself, asked twice if something was wrong at work, and both times I told him it was nothing, a difficult case at the hospital, nothing worth discussing at home. I hated how easily the lie came. I hated, more than that, understanding exactly how practiced this family must have felt, doing the same thing to me for 11 straight years. I hadn't planned for the truth to come out at Caleb's graduation. I want to be clear about that, because the accidental nature of what happened matters. I had, in fact, decided I would confront Marcus privately that same evening, after the reception, once Caleb was safely off with his friends and there was no chance of the conversation touching him directly. Patricia moved faster than my careful planning ever could. She'd had 2 glasses of champagne by the time she handed Marcus that card, more than her usual limit, loosened just enough that whatever internal filter had held this secret in place for 11 years slipped for exactly the length of one sentence. Make sure some of this goes to Ethan too, since he couldn't be here today. I don't believe she meant to say it. I've had 2 years now to sit with that, and I genuinely believe it was an accident, the kind of accident that happens when a person has been carrying something so long they occasionally forget, for half a second, which room they're standing in. When I asked, in front of 40 relatives, who Ethan was, nobody answered right away. It was Caleb, of all people, 17 years old and utterly unaware of the weight of what he was about to ask, who broke the silence first. "Wait," he said, looking between his father and grandmother with the confused half-smile he'd worn since Patricia first said the name. "Is that, do I have a brother?" I watched something collapse in Marcus's face at that exact question, faster and more completely than anything I'd witnessed from him in 11 years of marriage. Not guilt exactly, something closer to the specific relief of a man who has just watched the decision be taken entirely out of his hands. "Not here," he said, to the room generally, his voice cracking slightly on the second word. "Please, not here, not like this." But it was already happening. The way certain things, once started, simply cannot be stopped by anyone's preference for a better time or place. My sister-in-law had stopped refilling her plate. My father-in-law had set down his phone. And Patricia, realizing what she'd done, had gone very pale, one hand pressed flat against the gift table for balance, the same flat-handed pressure I'd seen on that envelope months earlier, except this time there was nothing left underneath her hand to hide. I didn't scream. I want to be honest that some part of me expected I would, expected 11 years of managed peace to finally break in some loud, dramatic way. Instead, standing there with Caleb's graduation cap still tucked under my arm, something in me went very quiet and very still, the way it goes quiet at the center of something too large to feel all at once. "His name is Ethan Whitfield," I said, and my voice came out steady in a way that frightened me a little, because I hadn't planned these particular words, hadn't rehearsed them the way I'd rehearsed a version of this conversation for the private confrontation I'd been planning. "He's 17. He plays baseball. His mother's name is Renee. And you," I looked at Patricia, "have been helping pay their mortgage for 11 years. The silence that followed was different from the first one. That first silence had been the silence of people waiting to see how bad it would get. This one was the silence of people understanding, all at once, that it had already gotten as bad as it was going to get, and now there was nothing left to do but watch what happened next. Patricia was the one who finally spoke, and what she said surprised everyone in that room, including me. She didn't deny it. She didn't apologize either, not directly. Instead, in a voice stripped of the smooth deflection she'd used on me in her kitchen months earlier, she said, "I've been trying to fix something that was never mine to fix for 11 years, and I am so tired, Naomi. I am so tired of being the only one holding this family together at the seams." Marcus, for his part, said almost nothing in that first devastating minute, which was, in its own way, the loudest thing he could have done. He simply stood there, the card still in his hand, staring at some point on the floor between us, and I understood, watching him, that whatever explanation was coming would arrive later, in private, once the shock of the room had thinned out enough for him to find his voice. It was my sister-in-law, Denise, a woman I'd always considered pleasant but peripheral, never especially close to me in 11 years of family gatherings, who spoke next, and her words landed harder than anything Patricia or Marcus had said. "I've known for 6 years," she said quietly, not looking at me, looking instead at her own hands. "I found out by accident too. I should have told you. I told myself it wasn't my place." She looked up then, finally meeting my eyes, and something in her face made it clear she understood exactly what she'd just admitted, and exactly what it might cost her. I didn't respond to Denise in that moment. I couldn't. There was only so much betrayal a person could process standing in a rented banquet hall with cake frosting drying on a nearby table and her son's graduation cap still tucked under one arm. Later that night, once the reception had ended and Caleb had gone home with friends for a celebratory dinner none of us had the heart to attend, Marcus finally spoke. We sat across from each other at our own kitchen table, the same table where he'd once told me his phone habits were just mom stuff, and this time, when he finally opened his mouth, what came out was not a deflection. "It started the year before I met you," he said, his hands wrapped around a coffee mug he wasn't drinking from. "Renee and I were together for about 8 months, right after college. It ended badly, not dramatically, just badly, the way things end when neither person is really ready for what's happening. I didn't know she was pregnant until almost 5 months in. By the time she told me, I'd already met you. We'd already started falling for each other. I told myself, God, I told myself so many things. That it wasn't fair to bring this into something new. That I needed time to figure out how to tell you. That every month that passed just made the next month's silence feel more necessary than the last." He stopped, staring down at the coffee mug, and I said nothing, because I understood, somehow, that interrupting him now would only give him an excuse to stop. "My mother found out about a year in," he continued. "She was furious, not at Renee, at me, for the mess of it, for what she saw as me abandoning a child the way, honestly, her own father abandoned our family when I was young. She made a decision I never asked her to make. She started helping Renee financially, quietly, and she told me she'd keep doing it as long as I promised never to make it your problem. I understand now how insane that sounds. At the time, exhausted and ashamed and 26 years old, it felt like the only door still open to me that didn't end in losing you." His voice cracked slightly, and for the first time that night, I saw something closer to real grief in his face than shame. "Every year it got harder to imagine telling you, because every year meant admitting I'd let it go one more year longer than the last. I watched Ethan grow up in school photos Renee sent my mother twice a year, because I never let myself ask for them directly. I told myself that not asking meant I wasn't as involved as I actually was, and I understand now what a coward's math that always was. I was afraid of exactly this night, Naomi. Every single year, I was afraid of this exact conversation. And every year I told myself I still had time before I'd have to have it. I didn't run out of chances. I ran out of time to keep telling myself I still had them." I asked him only one question that night, the same shape of question I would later understand had been sitting underneath every unasked question of our marriage. "Does Caleb have a right to know his brother?" "Yes," Marcus said immediately, without hesitation, the first fully unguarded thing he'd said all evening. "He does. I should have given both of them that a long time ago. It took me 5 months to decide what to do with what I now knew, and I want to be honest that those months were not dramatic in the way you might expect. There were no more confrontations at family events, no scenes at holiday dinners. There was, instead, a long, quiet unwinding of a marriage I had spent 11 years believing was built on complete honesty, and the slow, careful work of figuring out what, if anything, could be salvaged from what remained. Marcus and I are still married, though it isn't the marriage it was before that graduation. We're in counseling, separately and together, working through what it means to rebuild trust with someone who kept a decision this large from you not for one bad year, but for the entire span of your shared life. I don't know yet if we'll stay together permanently. I've stopped needing to know that answer immediately, which is its own kind of growth I didn't expect to find in the middle of all this. The consequence Patricia faced was not dramatic either, though it was real, and it mattered. I stopped inviting her to the small, ordinary family moments she'd always assumed were hers by default, the casual Sunday dinners, the unplanned drop-ins with the grandchildren. She lost, that year, the version of herself she'd spent decades protecting, the family matriarch who held everyone together through sheer force of care. What she'd actually held together, I came to understand, was a secret, at the cost of my own place at the center of a family I'd spent 11 years serving. Denise and I have not fully repaired what broke that night. She apologized more than once, sincerely I believe, but 6 years of silence isn't undone by an apology at a graduation reception, and I've told her honestly that I need more time than she's likely comfortable waiting for. I met Ethan for the first time that autumn, at a diner exactly halfway between our two towns, the same kind of careful, neutral meeting point you choose when you don't yet know what kind of relationship you're building. He was quieter than I expected, watchful in a way that told me he'd spent years learning caution around adults who came with complicated histories attached. Caleb came with me. The two of them, brothers who'd shared a father for 17 years without knowing it, sat across from each other in that diner booth with the particular awkwardness of two people trying to find the shape of something that should have existed all along. It isn't a relationship yet, not fully. It's the careful beginning of one. But it's mine now, ours, built openly, for the first time in this family's history, instead of hidden behind 11 years of practiced silence. Looking back now, I can see every moment I filed away instead of examining, the missing photographs, Tobias's slip of the tongue, the deleted call log, Patricia's hand pressed flat over that envelope. None of them were proof on their own. Together, they were a pattern I chose not to read, because reading it would have cost me the version of my family I'd spent a decade building my identity around maintaining. I understand now that being the person who holds a family together isn't the same as being someone that family trusts completely. Sometimes it's the opposite, sometimes you become so useful at managing everyone's comfort that nobody thinks to burden you with the truth at all. That's a harder lesson than it sounds, and I'm still, 2 years later, learning to tell the difference between being needed and being known. What stays with me most isn't the secret itself, it's how ordinary the mechanics of hiding it were. There was no elaborate scheme, no criminal conspiracy. There was a monthly check, a co-signed mortgage, a handful of school photographs mailed twice a year, folded so completely into an otherwise unremarkable family routine that it took 11 years and one accidental sentence at a champagne-loosened reception to surface at all. This story isn't really about infidelity, not fundamentally. It's about how a family can build an entire second architecture of loyalty around a secret without anyone ever calling a meeting to decide to do it. Patricia didn't set out to deceive me for over a decade. She set out, in her own mind, to protect her son from a mistake she believed would cost him everything, and in protecting him, she quietly, consistently chose his comfort over my right to the truth, year after year, without ever fully reckoning with what that choice cost me. That doesn't excuse it. It does complicate any easy story about who the villain is here. What changed permanently for me was my relationship to the role I'd built my identity around. I used to believe that being the one who held this family together, who smoothed every tension before it became a real conflict, was a form of love. I understand now it was also a form of exclusion I helped construct myself. Every time I stepped in to manage a problem instead of asking the harder question underneath it, I made it easier for everyone around me to keep deciding, on my behalf, what I could handle knowing. If there's a question this story leaves me with, it's this: how many families mistake managed peace for real honesty, and what does it actually cost the person doing all that managing, quietly, for years, without anyone ever asking if the arrangement was fair to her? That question doesn't have a clean answer. I'm still living my way into whatever mine turns out to be. I think about that banquet hall often, the smell of sheet cake, my son's cap still tucked under my arm, the exact half-second before Patricia's sentence turned my whole life sideways. I think about how close that secret came to lasting even longer, how easily 2 more glasses of champagne might never have been poured, How many more years I might have spent managing a family that had already decided, long before I ever met them, how much of the truth I was allowed to carry. What hurts most, even now, isn't what Marcus did at 26. It's understanding how many people around me chose, for years, to protect his comfort over my right to my own life. I've stopped needing to forgive that completely in order to keep moving forward from it. If you've ever discovered that the family you thought trusted you completely had quietly decided, without ever asking, how much of the truth you could handle, I think you already know there's no clean word for that particular ache. I'd love to know, is there a truth in your own family that everyone else seemed to know before you did? Drop one word in the comments, whatever it brings up for you. Thank you for sitting with this story with me. It took me a long time to be ready to tell it out loud.